In the summer of 1941, German anti-tank crews were firing everything they had at a Soviet tank, and the shells were just bouncing off, not deflecting and doing partial damage, actually bouncing off, falling into the dirt while the tank kept coming. That wasn't supposed to happen. Operation Barbarossa had been planned around the assumption that Soviet armor was large and obsolete. The Germans had studied what the Red Army was using. They knew about the BT series and the T-26. They went in with a reasonable intelligence picture of what they were going to face. The T-34 was not in that picture. When German crews and anti-tank gunners first encountered it in the weeks after June 22nd, some thought there was something wrong with their ammunition. Their 37mm anti-tank gun, which had performed fine against everything it had met in Poland and France, was genuinely useless against it. Shells were bouncing off the sloped front at ranges where they should have been killing it. There are German field reports from those early weeks describing crews firing 10, 15, even 20 rounds at a single T-34, trying anything that might work, targeting the tracks, waiting for a side shot. And all the while, the T-34's 76mm gun could destroy any German vehicle on the field with a single hit. The shock was real. It wasn't one engagement or one unlucky crew. It was happening across the front. Panzer commanders who had torn through France with complete confidence were writing back to headquarters describing a tank their weapons couldn't reliably kill, and understanding how that happened, why the T-34 existed, what it was, and why it terrified an army that was at the absolute peak of its capability. To understand the T-34, you have to go back about a decade and start with a Soviet tank program that was, by any honest measure, a mess. In 1930, the Soviet Union didn't have a real domestic tank industry. What they had was an enormous appetite for foreign military technology and the money to buy it. Soviet agents went abroad and came back with two things that would shape the next decade of Soviet armor: a British Vickers export license and the American Walter Christie suspension design. The Christie tank had never gone into production in the United States. The Americans designed it and didn't build it, and the Soviets said that sounded like their problem to have. In Soviet hands, the Vickers became the T-26 infantry tank. The Christie design became the BT series, fast cavalry tanks built around that distinctive wheel and track system. Both types were produced in enormous numbers. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had more tanks than any other country on Earth. Then they started using them, and the picture got considerably less impressive. At Lake Khasan in 1938 and Khalkhin Gol in 1939, the BT and T-26 were being knocked out by relatively modest anti-tank weapons. The Winter War against Finland in 1939 made it impossible to ignore. Thousands of tanks, and they were dying in large numbers against defenses that were, objectively, not particularly formidable. The lesson was clear. The Soviet Union needed something with real protection, meaningful firepower, and the cross-country mobility that Russian terrain demanded. And then, before anyone had finished arguing about what that tank should look like, Germany rolled through France in May 1940 and demonstrated what concentrated armor could do when used aggressively. The Soviets watched. They understood that their entire fleet needed a fundamental rethink. This is where a designer named Mikhail Koshkin becomes the central figure. His first attempt was the A-20, sloped armor, 45mm gun, diesel engine, keeping the dual wheel and track drive from the BT series. But the dual drive added mechanical complexity nobody wanted, and Koshkin himself wasn't convinced it was ambitious enough. He pushed for something more radical. There was resistance from the KV heavy tank program, which saw a new medium design as a direct budget threat. Koshkin pushed through it anyway, and what emerged was a new prototype with thicker armor, improved suspension, and most significantly, a 76.2mm gun instead of a 45mm. That was not a minor upgrade. That was a qualitative jump in what the tank could actually do to anything it was likely to meet. Stalin approved it. The T-34 project was official. So what did Koshkin actually design? Start with the armor, because that's where the T-34 made its most immediate impression. The hull front was angled at 60 degrees. The turret was rounded, and the effect of that sloping wasn't just aesthetic, it was physics. When an armor-piercing round hits a flat plate, all of its energy goes into punching through. When it hits a steeply angled plate, two things happen. The effective thickness is greater than the nominal measurement, because the round travels through more steel on a diagonal path, and the angle can cause deflection or shattering before penetration. The T-34's 60-degree front slope meant that its 45mm of actual steel behaved like closer to 90mm of vertically oriented armor in terms of what it could stop. German designers understood this principle. They just weren't applying it aggressively yet. The Panzer III and Panzer IV were built with flat, box-like plates. That was a conservative choice that would cost them. The gun was the 76.2mm F-34. At combat ranges in 1941, it could kill anything the Germans had on the field. The thickest armor on a Panzer III at the start of Barbarossa was around 50 to 60 millimeters. The T-34's 76 millimeters could penetrate that at ranges well beyond where those tanks were likely to engage each other. And firing composite rigid rounds with a tungsten penetrator, the numbers got more one-sided still. The engine was a V2 V12 diesel producing around 500 horsepower. Diesel matters for two practical reasons. It's significantly less flammable than petrol, meaning the T-34 was less likely to catch fire after a hit, and it gave better range, around 300 kilometers on a full load under road conditions. Then there were the tracks, 500 millimeters wide. That sounds like a technical detail until you think about moving a 28-ton vehicle across Russian mud in the spring thaw or through snow in December. German tanks had narrower tracks and higher ground pressure. They sank deeper into soft ground. They got stuck more easily. Soviet crews fighting alongside T-34s in those conditions knew exactly what the wide tracks meant. The German tanks were stuck. The T-34 kept moving. Before production began, Koshkin wanted to prove the design worked. He organized what was essentially an extreme endurance test. Two prototypes drove roughly 2,000 kilometers from Kharkov to Moscow. Because the project was still classified, they avoided main roads and drove mostly through mud and snow, which was a better test than any smooth road anyway. When the tanks arrived outside Moscow, beaten up and caked in mud but still running, they were shown to Soviet leadership. The critics who had been arguing against the program were considerably quieter after that. The journey exposed serious problems with the transmission that would haunt production tanks for years, and it cost Koshkin his life. He was riding exposed on the vehicle through the winter, caught pneumonia, refused to leave the crew for the return trip, and died in September 1940 just as the first production T-34s were coming off the line. He never saw what his tank would actually do in combat. By June 22, 1941, there were roughly 900 T-34s in the Soviet western districts, scattered among far larger numbers of older BT and T-26 types. The Germans didn't know they were there in any meaningful sense. Intelligence had picked up hints of a new Soviet design, but nothing specific enough to prompt serious concern. That assumption started breaking down almost immediately. The first T-34 encounters were scattered and confusing. German anti-tank crews would report that they had engaged a Soviet tank their weapons couldn't stop. The reports went up the chain. Nobody quite believed them at first, because these men were using weapons that had worked in every previous campaign. The 37mm had been fine in Poland, it had been fine in France. The idea that it was simply useless against something was hard to process without seeing it. German anti-tank crews who did see it had a consistent experience. They would acquire a T-34, open fire at what should have been effective range, and watch the shells deflect off the sloped front. Then they would try for a side shot, or aim at the tracks, or wait for any angle that gave them something. Some crews reported firing 15-20 rounds at a single tank before managing to damage it enough to stop it. And all the while, the T-34's 76mm could destroy any German vehicle in the engagement. The Panzer III, carrying the main burden of German tank versus tank fighting in 1941, mounted a 50mm gun in its most modern variant. That gun was better than the 37mm, but it was struggling against T-34 frontal armor at anything beyond close range. German tankers who had moved through France with complete confidence were encountering something that their standard engagement techniques didn't work against. Commanders began pulling 88mm anti-aircraft guns into direct anti-tank roles, because those were the weapons that could reliably penetrate T-34 armor at range. The 88 was effective. It was also a large towed gun designed for air defense, and everyone used against tanks was one not available for its intended purpose. It was improvisation, not a solution. Heinz Guderian, one of the architects of Germany's armored doctrine, wrote explicitly about the shock of encountering the T-34 and the inadequacy of existing German anti-tank weapons. Formal requests went back to ordnance for something that could deal with this. Those requests would eventually produce the Panther, the long-barreled Panzer IV, and an acceleration of the Tiger program. All of that would take time. In the short term, the Germans adapted through what they were genuinely better at than almost anyone else: training, tactical coordination, and the ability to improvise solutions under pressure. They used terrain. They coordinated fires from multiple positions. They found angles. And the tactical excellence that German officers and non-commissioned commissioned officers had built over years of training was what kept the T-34's advantages from being militarily decisive in 1941, not German equipment, which was in certain respects clearly outmatched. The German army in the summer of 1941 was not a force that scared easily. These were men who had gone through Poland, France, and the Balkans. They had fought the British Matilda, which also defeated their 37mm guns. They had fought French heavy tanks that were technically formidable. They knew how to adapt, and yet the T-34 produced something closer to genuine institutional alarm than anything they had encountered before. Part of it was the combination. The Matilda had thick armor, but a limited gun and slow speed. French heavy tanks like the Char B-1 were armored and armed, but designed around outdated tactical doctrine. The T-34 combined fast enough to match German mobility, armed well enough to kill anything they had, and protected well enough that their standard weapons couldn't reliably stop it. That combination created a problem that the earlier Allied tanks hadn't. The Panzer III's maximum armor thickness in 1941 was around 50 to 60 millimeters, the result of upgrades applied after the French campaign, but 60 millimeters of flat armor was still penetrable by the T-34's 76mm gun at combat range. The Panzer IV, designed primarily for infantry support, was in a similar position. Its armor was not significantly better. What the T-34 had actually done was expose a gap in German planning. The Wehrmacht had designed its anti-tank equipment around what Soviet armor actually was, which was rational. It hadn't adequately planned for the possibility that something qualitatively different might appear in significant numbers before there was anything capable of dealing with it. The formal response from German ordnance was to start working on what would become the Panther. The T-34's sloped armor was a direct influence on that design. Whether the Panther would have existed without the T-34 is a genuinely debated question, as some development work was already underway, but there is no serious argument that the T-34 encounters didn't accelerate the program and shape what the Panther turned out to be. In the field, the answer was tactical adaptation, better use of terrain, coordinated fires, flank attacks to reach the thinner armor on the T-34's sides and rear. The Germans were very good at all of that, but they were doing it because their equipment required it, and that was a problem they now understood clearly. Here's where the story gets more complicated. The T-34 that was causing all of this alarm in German headquarters was also, in a number of ways, a genuinely terrible vehicle to fight in. Start with the turret. It was a two-man design, which meant the commander had to command the tank, observe the battlefield, and load the gun simultaneously. In an active engagement, those three tasks are already more than one person can do well. His only view of the outside was a single periscope with a limited field of view, almost no situational awareness. The official rate of fire was around 5 rounds per minute. In actual combat, with a commander who was also loading, 2 rounds was more realistic. German tanks had a dedicated loader and a commander with a proper cupola and vision ports. The practical difference in combat effectiveness was significant. The turret had no basket. The floor beneath it didn't rotate when the turret traversed, which meant crew members with feet in the wrong position risked injury. With the fast electric traverse the T-34 had, that was a real hazard. Soviet optical quality was well behind German standards in 1941. The T-34's gun was capable of accurate long-range fire. The optics limited what the crew could actually do with it. Visibility from inside the hull was similarly poor. The driver sat in a cramped position with limited sight lines, and the hull gunner beside him had a small aperture next to his machine gun, and, in early production vehicles, no dedicated escape hatch. The transmission was arguably the worst single mechanical problem. It was extremely difficult to shift gears under any conditions, and in combat stress it jammed regularly. Soviet T-34 drivers are reported to have kept a hammer nearby to force the gear lever when it refused to move. That is not a description of a well-engineered gearbox. Most T-34s in 1941 did not have radios. Only the platoon commander's vehicle typically had one. The rest were expected to communicate using flags, or by watching the lead tank and copying its behavior. In actual combat, that system broke down almost immediately. Soviet tanks that couldn't communicate and tanks that couldn't coordinate tended to bunch up, make independent decisions, and die in disproportionate numbers. The armor itself, while effective at deflecting rounds, was made from a steel alloy prone to brittleness under impact. Even when a hit didn't penetrate, the impact could cause spalling, chunks of steel breaking off the interior surface at lethal velocity. Crews could be killed by a round that technically didn't get through the plate, all of which raises the obvious question. How did a tank with this many serious problems cause genuine alarm in one of the most experienced armies in the world? The answer is that the fundamental numbers, the protection, and the gun were so far ahead of German expectations that the tactical problems were almost secondary. A tank they couldn't reliably kill was a problem, regardless of how inadequate it was to fight from the inside. The T-34 didn't win the Eastern Front in 1941. The Soviet Union lost somewhere around 20,000 tanks that year. A significant portion broke down before reaching the fight and were abandoned. The German advance reached the outskirts of Moscow. By any measure, 1941 was a catastrophe for Soviet armor. But here is what the T-34 actually did. It told the Germans that the war they thought they were fighting was not the war they were actually in. Those first encounter reports changed German design priorities immediately and permanently. Work on the Panther was accelerated. Its sloped armor was a direct response to what the T-34 had demonstrated about armor geometry. Long-barreled guns for the Panzer IV and Sturmgeschütz III were pushed into production to give German units something that could handle Soviet armor reliably. The Tiger program was accelerated. Germany went into Barbarossa with equipment adequate for what they expected. They came out of 1941 knowing they needed something fundamentally better. Meanwhile, the Soviets were doing something the Germans couldn't match at scale: building. The relocation of Soviet tank factories to the Ural region in late 1941, loading entire production lines onto trains and moving them thousands of kilometers beyond German reach, was one of the most remarkable industrial operations of the entire war. Production stopped for over a month while everything was disassembled and reconstructed. Then the lines ran around the clock. At peak production in 1942, Soviet factories were turning out roughly 1,200 T-34s per month. The Germans produced around 8,500 Panthers across the entire war. The Soviets produced more T-34s than that in a good quarter. That arithmetic matters. And the T-34 itself kept improving. Better radios, a redesigned transmission, and in early 1944, the T-34/85, which put a 3-man turret and an 85mm gun onto the existing hull. The commander finally had a proper cupola. There was now a dedicated gunner and loader. The gun could engage Panthers and Tigers at combat range. It was a fundamentally different vehicle to fight in, built on the same basic chassis Koshkin had designed before the war. By the end of the war, the Soviets had built approximately 57,000 T-34s of various models. Some estimates put the post-war total closer to 84,000. It is by a significant margin the most produced tank in history. It also holds the less enviable record of being the most destroyed tank of the war, with around 44,000 lost in combat. What the T-34 changed, permanently, was the expectation of what a tank needed to be. Before 1941, the dominant German thinking was that you built a fast, well-engineered vehicle with adequate protection, and you made up the difference with superior training and doctrine. The T-34 demonstrated that armor and firepower could be combined at a cost and production scale that doctrine couldn't simply outrun forever. You could be better trained and still run out of options. Every major German tank development program after 1941 was shaped by those first encounters.